The jar weighed approximately 4 pounds. Glass, sealed with wax, filled with brandy because brandy was what Captain Harry Love had available at the campsite on Cantua Creek in the California heat of late July 1853, and what he needed, what the state of California required before it released $6,000 to any man who claimed to have killed Joaquin Murrieta, was proof, not a witness. Not a sworn statement from a ranger who had been on the payroll for 60 days and had every financial reason to claim the dead man was whoever the reward required him to be. Proof. Something a governor could hold in his hands and say, yes, this is the man. Pay these men their money. Harry Love dropped the head into the brandy, sealed the jar, and began the long ride back to Sacramento. He had been in the field for 2 months. He had buried 4 men at Cantua Creek. He had 1 jar in one hand, 3-fingered Jack Garcia's right hand, cut off at the wrist and packed in a separate container. And $6,000 waiting at the end of the road if 17 people in California could be made to agree on what they were looking at. He was reasonably confident about the 17 people. Welcome to American Old West Tales, where the frontier gets the honest accounting it has always deserved. To understand the jar, you have to understand the problem it was invented to solve. The California of 1853 was not the California of the gold rush fantasy. The cheerful prospectors with their pans and their optimism, the orderly mining camps, the American dream playing out in miniature on the banks of the American River. That California had lasted approximately 18 months before the specific pressures of 100,000 men competing for a finite supply of gold in a territory with no established legal infrastructure produced the predictable results. By 1852, the southern mines of Calaveras and Tuolumne counties were running through the violence of a society assembling itself faster than any court system could follow. Into this environment, the foreign miners' tax of 1850 had inserted a specific and targeted injustice. The tax required foreign-born miners, which in practice meant the Mexicans, Chileans, and Chinese who had come to California before the Anglo-American rush and who often possessed superior mining knowledge. To pay $20 a month for the right to work claims that the law simultaneously made it difficult for them to own. Mexican citizens who had been California residents before the American annexation of 1848 found themselves reclassified as foreign nationals in territory that had been theirs under 3 successive governments. The land that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had promised to protect their right to occupy was being occupied by the men who had written the treaty. Joaquin Murrieta. If that name applied to a single person, which historians have never been able to confirm, and which the California legislature specifically avoided by listing 5 separate Joaquins in the act that authorized the Rangers, was the product of this specific injustice. His story, as it was told in the months between the reward posting and the jar arriving in Sacramento, ran roughly as follows. He had come from Mexico, or possibly Sonora, possibly Chile, the accounts disagreed, during the gold rush. Anglo miners had driven him from his claim. His common-law wife had been assaulted. His half-brother had been lynched on a false accusation. He had responded with the specific organized violence of a man who had decided that if the law would not protect him, he would build a different kind of law that operated by different rules in the same territory. By 1853, the band operating under the Joaquin name, whoever its leader actually was, had killed somewhere between 19 and 32 people across the southern mines, depending on which newspaper account was believed. They had stolen horses by the hundreds. They had robbed miners on isolated roads with the efficiency of men who understood that isolated roads in California in 1853 offered almost no legal recourse to the people being robbed on them. Governor John Bigler signed the California Rangers Act on May 11, 1853. What the reward system required as proof preserved physical evidence of death, positively identified by sworn witnesses, delivered to territorial or state authority within a reasonable period. In the absence of a recognizable intact body in which the California heat and the logistics of transport made impractical across distances measured in days of riding, a durable substitute was acceptable. The substitute the California Rangers developed was a glass jar. The contents were non-negotiable. The preservation medium was whatever alcohol was available. Captain Harry Love had been a Texas Ranger and a Mexican War veteran. He was 41 years old in 1853 and had spent 2 decades in environments where the line between sanctioned violence and unsanctioned violence was a matter of institutional framing rather than moral distinction. He had, according to his own reports, received intelligence about Murrieta's location from a man named Jesus Feliz, Murrieta's brother-in-law, whom Love had captured and whose cooperation had been obtained through the specific persuasion techniques available to a man holding another man prisoner in a California canyon in July, on the morning of July 25, 1853. Love's Rangers came over a rise above Cantua Creek and found a group of Mexicans eating breakfast. What followed was documented in Love's own report to the governor: the confrontation, the gunfire, the deaths. 4 Mexicans killed, 2 captured. One of the dead was claimed as Murrieta. Another was identified as Three-Fingered Jack Garcia. Manuel Garcia, Murrieta's enforcer, a man the Yale expositor had described as a monster of vice, whose cruelty had included the murder of Chinese miners on the roads between camps. Garcia's distinguishing feature was his right hand, the missing fingers that had given him his name, and that would, once preserved, constitute the proof the reward required for his identification. Love had both bodies worked on before the July heat made the decision for him. The head came off Murrieta's body cleanly. Garcia's skull, having absorbed a bullet, did not preserve well in the brandy. It had to be buried at Fort Miller. The hand came off at the wrist and packed separately. The jar went north. In Mariposa, people paid $1 to look at it. In Stockton, the jar sat on a table at the Stockton House Hotel with a poster advertising the attraction at a cost of $1 per person. The poster is preserved. The poster describes the contents as the head of the renowned bandit Joaquin Murrieta. In San Francisco, the jar went on extended exhibition. 17 people signed affidavits attesting that the head inside the glass was Joaquin Murrieta. The 17 included a Catholic priest, which was the specific credential the period considered most resistant to motivated dishonesty. In August of 1853, an anonymous letter arrived at the San Francisco Alta California newspaper. The letter alleged that Love and his Rangers had killed innocent Mexican Mustang catchers, men who had been working the range, not robbing it, and had bribed or pressured witnesses into signing affidavits for a head that was not Murrieta's. The letter offered no name and no evidence beyond the allegation. A woman who claimed to be Murrieta's sister looked at the head and said she did not recognize it. The scar she remembered on her brother's face was not visible. Multiple reports of Murrieta's sightings circulated across the southern counties in the weeks after the jar went on display. None were confirmed. Governor Bigler received the jar, the affidavits, and Love's report. He authorized payment, $6,000. Divided among 20 California Rangers who had spent 60 days in the field on $150 a month each and had come back with a jar. The head was eventually acquired by a San Francisco museum where it sat on display for 50 years. Charged admission, answering questions from visitors, existing as the specific disturbing artifact of a reward system that required physical proof and had never specified how that proof should be obtained, only that it needed to be durable enough to survive the ride back and legible enough that 17 people could look at it and sign their names. On April 18, 1906, the San Francisco earthquake destroyed the museum. The jar, the head, and whatever truth they contained about what had happened at Cantua Creek on July 25, 1853 were lost in the rubble. Harry Love died in 1868, shot by his wife's lover in a dispute that had nothing to do with Murrieta or California or the reward system that had made him briefly famous. The doubts about whether the head in the jar had belonged to the man on the poster followed him for 15 years and were still following him when he died. Unresolved, in the specific way that questions about identity on the frontier tended to remain unresolved when the only available proof was a glass jar full of brandy. The question that the California reward system of 1853 answered is not the question historians have been arguing about since. Was it Murrieta's head? The question the system answered was simpler and considerably more disturbing. It answered, "What will a man do for $6,000 in California in July?" The answer was, cut the head off a dead man on a creek bank, pack it in brandy, ride it to Sacramento, and charge $1 a look until the government agrees to pay. The frontier did not invent this logic. It simply gave it room to breathe. Here is the question for you, the one worth debating in the comments. If the reward system required physical proof of death and the only reliable preservation method in 1853 California was a glass jar, was Harry Love operating within the rules of the system he had been hired to serve? Or had the system itself created something that no civilized legal framework should have permitted to exist?